remote viewing exercises regarding Mars, and that team at Emory of remote viewers found that the Martians do want to relocate here, that they already have colonies in the mountains outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and in remote regions of South and Central America, and that how could we fault them because this is such more of a livable planet.
Yeah, give and take.
Right, so maybe ultimately my work in the Mars area here publicly will be to acclimate the people of Earth to the reintegration of our Martian relatives back into civilization here on Earth. Why should they be barred from our planet? They are our relatives, and it's a lot nicer to live here than on Mars, and I think we should permit that.
I was wondering how they convinced all those civilians to go to Mars.
Profound psychological manipulation, almost tantamount to mind control. Now, I'm hopeful that because by the time we were trained, almost 100,000 had gone, that many, many Mars whistleblowers will come forward, maybe even with paperwork, their credentials and paperwork. I don't have any paperwork. But Brett and I know this, and that is before we left the Shasta region after those 3 weeks, we were subjected to brainwashing in a local hospital. We went into that hospital with our fathers on our feet, and we came out on gurneys. So what they did was they gave us all this training. So for example, we just had it in our unconscious, and then they decided to brainwash us and erase it temporarily. What's amazing is that brainwashing remained locked for decades, so that it just surfaced after I had already done my Mars research findings in 2008. But Brett and I have literally been sitting around, and just commiserating about the fact that we can't believe that it was locked up there for so long. But as I'll show in my further lecture here, there's been very specific data that we've corroborated that can't be the result of mutual delusion or reinforcement of fantasy. And I'll describe some of those data points. And that's why Brett is such an important whistleblower and why I think he's going to play an important role. Jan?
Was that mind control with drugs?
I believe that it was, the classic CIA drugging and verbal reinforcement of memory to forget. Remembering to forget. I don't think it was trauma-based but I remember just being in a funk and kind of out of it the whole drive, 800 or whatever, 700 miles back to Chatsworth. Yes.
So, how did you feel about your father and being, did you enjoy all this? Were you do it because you were afraid, or?
Well, from earliest childhood, I had basically been asked to buck up and deal with experiences that were both awe-inspiring and terrifying as a result of my father being in the aerospace community and in the CIA. So, for example, when he told me around the campfire that some of us are going to Mars, my mind kind of spaced out. It's like, oh great, I'm going back into government service again. I really had no choice. I was born into it. And my dad was a decent and responsible person. One principle I want to apply here is, again, I don't think I'm borrowing it from Donald Rumsfeld, because I think he stole it from me as a result of quantum access. But, we know what we know, we know what we don't know, but we don't know what we don't know. So what I apply is what I call the post-Vietnam principle, which is you can't presuppose that other kind, compassionate, intelligent Americans would make decisions that you wouldn't do until they start getting involved in intentional wrongdoing, like torture. So was my dad at that point complicit in brainwashing? Yeah. So I can blame him for that. But earlier as a kid on Pegasus, we know he was in denial about the fact that they were using brainwashing. But my point is, if you were sitting around a table in Washington with 12 people who were determining how we would respond to a cultural or an astronomical threat to our planet, let's say, and needed to place teenagers on Mars so that they would become the Mars leaders of tomorrow or whatever, would you go so far as to train kids and maybe even brainwash them if that was a necessary programmatic element? Most people would say no. They would give themselves the moral high ground and they would say, nope, I'd never do that. But what if it came up in a discussion among a group of, cabinet officials, military officers, and advanced aerospace scientists like my dad? In other words, we don't know ultimately what they were dealing with. So even though it sounds heinous for him to walk me into the Reading Community Hospital or wherever that happened, the Redwood Community Clinic behind the McLeod Market, it looks like he was morally compromised, but again, we don't know what we don't know. He may have been told by non-human elements to involve me. We ultimately don't know. So we don't know what degree of moral choice making was made. We can put ourselves in the morally superior position and say that's horrific, that your dad is to be faulted for that. But again, we don't know what was driving the experiences. It might have been totally out of his hand. My impression from both my Pegasus experiences and my Mars experiences is that decent people in these programs, like my father, like Tom Stillings, like Captain Ernest Garcia of the Army Security Agency, that they were trying to buffer the impact on us because they had no control over our involvement. And I certainly was never asked. It was heartening to hear from Laura that she, in a sense, was being both recruited in a manipulated way, but also, to some extent, being given the freedom to decide, to say no, about joining the Mars colony, which is obviously a much more substantial investment of time up there. But I had no opportunity to say no. And again, I'm getting ahead of myself in the lecture, but when Courtney Hunt of the CIA asked me about going up in '81, this is a year after the training program, I declined, as Laura did, and then I ultimately said, why should I, or why do I have to? And he said, because the survival of the human race depends on it. And then at that point, I made the same decision that people in combat make if they believe that their side has the greater moral cause. I decided that I would go even if I would end up dying going up there or on the surface. So it was semi-volitional at that point. But was it scary as hell, just the notion, the thought of going up? Yeah. So, I'm not going to put on any airs and say that I was, John Carter, Mars Explorer. Thanks, I want to go. Get me up there as soon as possible. But as you'll see, I did say something clever in the jump room that I'm happy about on the first time up. But no, I didn't want to go. It was scary. And at the same time, I certainly didn't have an option to say no. Actually, Courtney said, well, you're going up, so get used to it. He was basically saying you can't say no, you have to go. And Courtney also was, like I said, was very idealistic ultimately in helping me integrate my experiences into reality. So, but no, this was an emergency program. If we didn't go, we might lose the planet. The U.S. was leading the effort, and the implication here, the agreement factually between Brett and I, is that right at the time we're being trained, 100,000 had already been sent, 31 years ago. Okay, so what else did Al James talk about except how many we had sent up there? Predators on the surface. He explained that we would be able to outrun most of them. And he showed us drawings and photographs, telephoto lens photographs of the predators, apparently taken by Mars explorers. But he told us that 2 or 3 we would not be able to outrun, and because they were faster than humans. And he said, at that point, you can decide to either fight or sacrifice yourselves. He said, I've often wondered what this would be like. I guess, you've got this little dinosaur in front of you and just kind of allow yourself to relax and be eaten. Ed has kind of a dark sense of humor. He is Dr. Gloom, Dr. Doom. Dr. Doom, Mr. Doom? Dr. Doom. So now, what was I given during my trips up there to confront the unenviable prospect that I would confront one of the several species that humans could not outrun? I was given a suicide pill if captured. Brett reminded me of that. I had forgotten that. He said, yes, you said to me on the surface, do you have a suicide pill? Because I'd been issued one, and Brett said no. But I had been issued a suicide pill. And I remember being at a barbecue in a backyard in La Cañada near Caltech, NASA JPL. And I was shown this flash gun that we had up there, and it had 3 settings: kill, stun, and heat. It was a metal gun, like a flash gun, and the left position was kill, the right was basically shock. If you shot it at an animal, it would just be shocked. And the third was heat, so you could light a cigarette or start a campfire or something. And they showed me while they were demonstrating. So I don't smoke, and I didn't then. I said, but if you or somebody else does light a cigarette, remember to put it in the right position rather than the left one before you light it. We don't want to lose any personnel from friendly fire. So they had an animal, this poor unfortunate creature. I forget what it was because I repressed it. It was either a cow or a lamb or a goat or something. And I know who said it. Wasn't my dad, but I don't want to say who had the gun. But he said, watch this, Andy, let's have some barbecue. And they took the stun gun and they shot an animal, and it was killed. And they said, go over and see how how well done it is, Andy. And I went over to where this animal's remains were, and it was just a pile of ashes. Actually, ashes that you can just blow away in the sun. It wasn't even charcoal, or you couldn't even see any bones or anything. It was just like feathery, diaphanous ashes, and I actually blew it over, like just went. Now, Ed did say, this is one of the extra-political dimensions of this. Ed stated that whenever possible, by whatever means possible, even if you choose to sacrifice yourself rather than use force on the surface against a Martian humanoid or animal, you are to avoid armed confrontation of any kind to the best of your ability with any life form on Mars. So we were equipped to either sacrifice ourselves via suicide or sacrifice ourselves via surrender to predation, becoming, the Albert Brooks character in Defending Your Life, lunch or dinner. Or we were free to fire on a predator. But we were strongly admonished that the programmatic goal was to avoid any use of the weapon on the surface. So it was up to us. They were putting us up there. You can take the suicide pill, you can fire on a life form on another planet, but be aware, I think he made a joke then, he said something like, be aware that if you do, you may lose the fight or later be blamed for prompting an interplanetary war. Okay, so we had the gun. I never used it on the surface, and obviously I'm still here, and I was never confronted. I mentioned, I think, the goals of the U.S. presence on Mars, of establishing extraterrestrial defense posture, of creating a basis for U.S. sovereignty, and then acclimating Martian humanoids and animals to our presence. So after explaining that the initial thrust that was causing them to put this 100,000 people up there, or more, was to acclimate the indigenous life forms to our presence on their planet, and after just explaining the predation that we might face, he said, again jokingly, in other words, your goal is to be seen and not eaten. And so at a CIA training facility in Burbank, California, I was put in a room with video screens on all four sides and given a gun, and I had to prepare to look around. They were trying to get us to look around every 30 seconds. And by look around, they meant, okay, here you're looking this way, and you've just pulled your gun, or you're just like mulling around like a sight up there. Every 30 seconds, you then want to go to your left, or to your right, or do a 180. So I did like several hours of training where this woman's voice was going, look around, look around. 30 seconds again, look around. And what they had usually blank screens, but then you might see this little dinosaur-like creature go running along the horizon. In other words, they were trying to put us in, they put us in this simulator where they showed you that if you just sat on a bench while you were talking to some other Mars visitors, and you were there for 3 minutes, you might turn around, there might be like this little baby dinosaur behind you trying to eat you. Okay, so we were trained to literally become sort of hyperkinetic in our behavior on the surface. And Brett remembers that he sat for 2 minutes without looking around, and I actually took him to task. One of the times when we were up there, we didn't go up together, but we rejoined on the, regrouped on the surface. And he said, you were yelling at me, going, Brett, didn't you get any kind of training? Weren't you trained to look around? And again, there was something remiss about his training, because he doesn't remember being in this training room. And he also doesn't remember being given a gun. So, in any case, he did say that he learned from me on the surface that he was supposed to look around every 30 seconds. Okay. So, and then also at a chemistry lab at Cal State University in Northridge, near Chatsworth, Courtney Hunt showed me the rudimentary respiration device that I would take up on the first trip to see whether I would cope with the lesser oxygen levels in the Martian atmosphere, 10% versus 17% on Earth. So I did have some training in weaponry and respiration and in vigilance from predation, which was very kind of them. Okay, so where was the jump room? This drawing is courtesy of William Brett Stillings. He's been very helpful and has really joined our effort in documenting things. This is, let me see if I can, this is the CIA building in El Segundo. Brett has established that it's actually exactly 2 kilometers from the Hughes building at 999 North Sepulveda, where the jump room was. This is a map that is upside down. This is the south. This is the north. So this area here is the southern reaches of the Los Angeles International Airport, LAX. This is Imperial Boulevard east and west, or Imperial Avenue east and west. And then, let's see if I can isolate. Yeah, this is recent satellite footage. This is Sepulveda Boulevard, the longest boulevard in Los Angeles. It goes on for miles and miles and miles.
Where's Fry's?
Beg your pardon?
Where's Fry's?
Fry's is over on the left. Okay, so right.
The beach is to the left?
Exactly.
Huh?
The beach is to the left?
Yeah, the Pacific Ocean is out here.
Right?
This is the southern periphery of the Los Angeles International Airport. The jump room, it's hard for me at this great distance to find it. The jump room was at 999 North Sepulveda in El Segundo, California, due west of that much more visible cluster of aerospace buildings here. You can see the sign for Grumman, for example, from the 405 freeway. Or no, not from the 405, but from Sepulveda when you go south past the eastern perimeter of the Los Angeles airport. And Brett has identified this as the CIA facility, exactly 2 kilometers from the jump room. That might be relevant, it might not be. In those years, the facility was owned and operated by Hughes Aircraft. There's the Howard Hughes connection again to the secret space program. I think somebody's going to write a book about that someday. This again is from the aerial view, but you can see some of the building. In those years, somebody here was mentioning to me, they remember what this building looked like. It was a simple, square building with tungsten steel stripes and blue windows. It was like your classic Bauhaus design intelligence community office building in suburban Virginia,
Yeah,
right? Right? Ken, right? So, but then since then, they've actually stripped off the front, and you can see people walking through hallways, and there's this kind of meaningless attachment they put on it to make it more look like the Sherman Oaks Galleria, kind of. Okay, so the building was actually remodeled on the exterior, I think, to hide what had been going on there in the 80s, or California got a facelift or something. But that's the building, at 999 North Sepulveda. Yeah, with the helicopter pad on top. That's not the teleport. That's just the helicopter pad.
It's 6 o'clock.
Oh, okay.
Would you take a break?
Yeah, we're just about ready to jump to Mars. That's a great time to jump into a break. Great. Okay, great, yes. Great. Under the tutelage of Ed Dames. Brett and I have both corroborated the fact that we underwent some form of suppression of our memory at the end of that summer of 80, so that when we were approached during the 81, actually, do I have a signal here? Is Ken here?
It's coming up.
Oh, it's coming up. So when Brett and I were going up to Mars initially in 81, it's not as if we were in immediate possession of our memories of just having been through the seminar during the previous summer. In fact, in Chatsworth, California, in the summer of 1981, Courtney M. Hunt of the CIA, who really entered my life at this time, and we remained in communication until he had a stroke in which he lost the ability to speak in 2001, introduced me to Regina Dugan that summer, and I understood that meeting to be an introduction to somebody I had never met before, even though I tend to remember people and faces and names and personas. And we had not only been in this very profound experience of being trained for Mars for 3 weeks during the previous summer, but as I noted, we were essentially recreating in the evenings at, for example, the Finlandia Hotel during the last week and a half, and we had all become friends. And so I was introduced to her in summer of 81 and didn't know who she was. So we had been memory blocked about our training, which kind of suggests to me that they just wanted our training to be available almost at the level of the unconscious, like to be wary of predators on the surface, but not thinking about all the details. So here's El Segundo, south, as we go north up the image, where the jump room is at the corner of Sepulveda Boulevard and East Imperial Avenue, or East and West Imperial Avenue, right south of LAX. Hunt took me there in July of 1981. He picked me up in Chatsworth in his private automobile, drove me down there. He parked on a, he made a right and then went into the property and then made a right. And in those years there was, I remember there being a road there rather than this parking lot and more grass. And we actually found the traffic stanchion still in place there as a remnant of how this site plan was in 1981. During my August 2010 visit to this facility to try to just reconnoiter the location and prompt my memories of the building. The Austrian filmmaker Frank Jacob went there this year and went into the building, was actually stopped by 4 security guards and told that he had to leave the building because, quote unquote, sensitive activities were going on in the building. But I've not yet entered the building because I had my experience at the gates of the Sandia National Labs about having my car keys taken away and being told that I was not immediately free to leave because, you know, Homeland Security was being called. So I don't really want to go into that building. As I told Carrie Cassidy of Project Camelot, you know, I don't want to go into that building because last time I did, I went to Mars. So as we walked in, as you can see today, there's a big 666 at the corner of Sepulveda and Imperial. And in those years, this was, as I said, more of a simple Bauhaus construction. They've renovated the exterior to make it more contemporary in its design. In those years, there was a small metallic 666 over the doorway into the center of the building. And as we approached it the first time, I said to Hunt, realizing I was going to Mars, I said, great. The building you're sending me to Mars in is located at 666 upside down. Actually, I misspoke. It's actually 999. So today, there's if you're down there in El Segundo, there's 3 big red 9s. And as I entered the building, when there were just 3 small 999s above the doorway, I said, great, you're sending me up to Mars in a building located at 666 upside down. I think I said that because for me, the principal mental block about going up to Mars was teleporting there in the jump room and then having my feet placed down on the surface of another planet, which would mean that at certain times the Earth was going to be above my head. And even though I was a child of the space age, that still seemed like somewhat of a bizarre situation to be in. We went into the building. He parked his car on that street that still existed there over here. We went in here, went into the elevator area that's sort of recessed into close to the center of the building. You go around, at least then you went around a wall and you found an elevator landing. We went up to the 5th floor. We went into the only office that was on the 5th floor, which was a large suite, not unlike those Fijian suites that lawyers use where you have a big marble counter and multiple offices around it. And there was just one man working there. I believe it was a Saturday morning. And he said, oh, you brought me another one, huh? And Courtney Hunt laughed as only the cigarette-smoking guy from the CIA can laugh, kind of derisively or sarcastically, sort of. And Hunt then said, okay, Andy, you can get in the teleporter. And I said, and I realized he did say teleporter, so the jump room technology must be based on teleportation rather than a newer technology. But the difference was we could bring metal. For example, I didn't have to worry about my eyeglasses, and there was never any discussion about taking metal into the jump room. Obviously, I had been given a respiration device that contained metal components, and the the flash gun was metallic. So they had somehow eliminated that risk of electrostatic discharge. And I said, that's the jump room? And he said, yes. So just get back into the elevator. We're going to send you up to the 8th floor, and then from there to Mars. So I remember going up to the top floor, which was the 8th floor, and for several years, I think Alfred can corroborate this, I had stated that this was an 8-story building in El Segundo, immediately south of the Los Angeles International Airport. So we went up to the top floor of this building at 999 North Sepulveda, which is the 8th floor. The elevator seemed to translate southward when we reached the 8th floor, and Brett Stillings noted that there's actually 2 elevator shafts here. When we were filming over here with Bill Ryan and Carrie Cassidy in August of 2010, Carrie noticed that in the back of the building there's an extra pod that goes nowhere. We may have literally translated into that pod and from there to Mars. So I was standing in the elevator and I grew impatient. It was like 15 minutes past and then 20, and I was getting agitated because I'm the kind of person who likes to start things and not wait around. And I finally yelled into the intercom. Hunt kept on asking me, "Are you ready? Are you all right? Are you ready to go?" And I finally grew impatient and yelled, "Light this candle." Quoting, of course, Alan Shepard in Freedom 7 during the first, immediately prior to being sent into space for the first time under the Mercury program. The jump room was simply the elevator. I could see, imagine this mass here is a box-like elevator. I could see lights flashing in panels on the top and the bottom of the elevator, and then about 20 minutes into the teleporting, the box-like structure of the elevator began morphing into a cylinder where the ceiling translated into the direction I was looking at in the cylinder. And I had to kind of like, as Hunt had explained to me, I was going to have to kind of adjust as the jump room morphed into a cylinder and the ceiling was now swirling like in a big spiral or wormhole effect. When that happened, there was pressure on the ear. I consulted Dr. Brooks Agnew. It was about the pressure at 40 feet underwater when I was getting my scuba training. And he said that that's 2 atmospheres, so it wasn't really that intense of a pressure against the eardrum. But there was a mentally deranging and nauseating sensation of sort of having your perception kind of twisted too for those 5 minutes or so when the jump room was in a cylindrical shape. And then that physical pressure and that mental sense of stress and of being scrunched mentally and sort of feeling a little sickish abated after about 5 minutes as the jump room began to morph back into its original shape. And as Hunt had described, the jump room opened in a cavern on the planet Mars. There was a jump room infrastructure had been built sort of into an ancient Martian cavern. There was a stone staircase up on the right, and I walked up that into the area behind a skull on the surface. All these years, 35 years after the face on Mars at Cydonia has been debated, we have to understand that Mars, there's not one face on Mars, there are 1,000 faces on Mars. Constructing artificial heads and faces and skulls of humanoids and animals is essentially the leading form of public art among the indigenous Martian population. The objects on the surface that would be recognizable to an intelligent humanoid mark the areas of passage into the underground civilization. So in our training with Ed Dames, it had been explained to us, and then Courtney Hunt reinforced this with me, that if you're on the surface and you're fleeing from a predator, find anything that looks like a public artwork of a skull, a face, a statue of an animal, or whatever, because those mark the points that you can access to get down into the underground cavern, underground civilization, and evade a predator. So I walked through the dugout-like area, baseball dugout-like area behind the skull, through the eye of the skull, and onto the surface. The surface of Mars is predominantly rust red, although there are patches of soil that are tan, kind of yellow ochre colored, and even brown. The air was thin. It was somewhat, well, I still had my mask on initially. The sky was blue. There is oxygen in the Martian atmosphere. Oxygen is a clear gas, and hence it refracts a blue sky. So as my colleagues and I in the Mars Anomaly Research Community, most especially I'd like to thank Paul Goodwin for corroborating the fact that my statement that the Martian sky was blue, because we've now published images of the blue sky of Mars in NASA's own images. I stood there still wearing my respiration device, and I heard footfall behind me, and I thought, oh great, I'm going to be eaten here on my first trip out of the underground location. And it was in fact an Earthling. It was a young man about 25 years of age, wearing ordinary street clothes, just right off the streets of El Segundo, as it were, or anywhere in the US, whatever. And he was short, and then 2 other individuals quickly joined my location in front of the skull. And I was yelling at him, can I take my mask off? And I think he was laughing because he knew that I could. And also I had forgotten there was a communication device inside the helmet. So I was just yelling, probably it was really loud. The female, it may have been Regina Dugan. She was thin, although I don't know if Regina smokes, but so I don't want to necessarily say it was her. But the female, who also was 24, 25 years old, actually took out a cigarette and began smoking. Hence, I guess, you know, she had really adapted to the lesser oxygen. And so I stood there, and he said, yes, you can take your mask off. I took my mask off, and the best way I can describe what it was like to breathe on Mars is that it's kind of asthmatic, like that temporary asthma you get in a smoggy city like Los Angeles or Sao Paulo, Brazil, after a day of exercise, like swimming all day in a smoggy climb, and then you have kind of this temporary asthma where you have difficulty getting a full breath. It was sort of like that. I could breathe, I didn't get faint or anything. And in all my subsequent trips to Mars, I never brought any respiration equipment. In that location in particular, there was a pungent sulfuric smell, which I believe is the sulfur content of the Martian atmosphere or ground. And I pretty much just stood there for about 9 minutes, and I said, can I go home now? And they said yes, because I knew that it was just going to be an initial trip and that I had to go by myself. That was sort of the protocol, so you didn't always feel you had to. We had to get used to going up there by ourselves, so they sort of, you know, it was sort of a trial by fire where we had to go up the first time by ourselves. So I went back down the staircase into the jump room. The door was open, and sat there for 45 minutes. And in that location, the door closed automatically. You didn't go through this protocol to make it close. And I sat in the corner for 45 minutes, pretty much hoping and praying that the door would close and I would be sent back to El Segundo, and ultimately I was. And the same process repeated itself. The morphing of the box-like structure, the pressure on my ears and on my mind as the wormholing or what have you was effectuated by the jump room. I do not know how the jump rooms are working because obviously they challenge our notions of ordinary time-space physics and of just the basic laws of physics. I mean, how can you punch a physical object through a paraphysical or non-physical hole in space and have it go there and land from one spherical domain like Earth and land on another spherical domain like Mars? It shouldn't be possible. I think what they had done, and they were working on this towards the time that I was in Pegasus, is they had found some form of material that they could use basically to wrap around you while teleporting, maybe to make it less fearsome, jumping through a vortal tunnel, not enshrouded in a protecting environment. But again, Hunt did call it the teleport is the jump room. So I think there was continuity between Tesla teleportation and whatever Howard Hughes and his colleagues developed at Hughes Aircraft, or wherever the jump rooms came from. But the jump rooms exist, and they have been confirmed now by Michael Relf, myself, Arthur Neumann, who of course is the Henry Deacon informant, and Brett Stillings, and certainly they're implied by Laura's account, because she wasn't going to be getting to the Mars colony to stay there for many years with her sons via conventional rocketry. I mean, we have no evidence of rockets leaving the Earth taking people to the Mars colony. So a growing number of people are confirming the existence of the jump rooms, including researchers who have been on the case, like David Wilcock. Okay, now we go into the third part of my presentation, the findings. My findings begin in, let me go back just a step, one tick back. On the second trip, I go up there with Courtney Hunt in August of 1981, and we walk out of the same skull on the surface. I don't have any respiration equipment, nor does Courtney. He was a smoker, chain smoker, but he could breathe on the surface. And we walked over about a half mile to a stone cottage, kind of like one of those cottages, not an adobe, but a stone cottage that you will cobble together like in rural Arizona. We walked onto the curtilage of the property, in other words, just the earthen area around this stone cottage. And I saw what I thought was a man sitting over in the left part of the property. But then as we neared the front door of this structure, it bounded towards us, and I could see that it was a bald man with the upper torso and arms of a Homo sapien male, but the lower body of what we would consider a grub on Earth, like a pupal stage of a butterfly. He had almost like somebody in like one of those sleep sacks, but the lower part of his body, the lower half, actually right below the chest, was just like this ribbed, grub-like or pupal or larval-like body, but he was clearly an adult organism. And I interpreted his noise as being lethal because we had been, clearly the fear of predators was still informing my behavior, even if it was suppressed by brainwashing from the previous year, the previous summer. And he bounded towards us, making a noise. The best I can describe it is to say that it sounded like a dog barking and a man snarling simultaneously. It was like, and so just instinctively I stepped behind Hunt, thinking he was older and that he could take the first bite, or give the first bite. And Courtney was exceptionally distilled in his sense of humor, and without even looking back at me, he said, "He's harmless." And that, in fact, was the case. Courtney then grabbed the rusty screen door. It was actually a screen with a metal frame that had thoroughly rusted, and he opened up the door, and it fell away in his hands, and he stacked it against to the side. We went inside. It was a one-room cottage, and we encountered a man named Howard, who was so paranoid and so hebephonetic in his verbal delivery, talking about everything that had happened, that he was sort of scrambling backwards and fearful that we were there to kill him, and just out of his mind in a kind of an exposure crisis on the surface there, probably for many months or even years. And he was stammering away about how he had lost several team members on the surface. Yeah, they got Bob Stevens and that kind of thing. And he was begging with Courtney to allow him to come home, but he said he just was really almost pretty gentle with Howard and said, I'd like to, Howard, but we can't. I've got to bring Andy home. So we then left his cottage, and I don't know why somebody would have been left in situ like that. We never know what agreements people signed. Perhaps he was a lifer in a federal penitentiary who had volunteered to go up and be one of these early colonists on Mars in exchange for sitting in a 4x5 or 8x10 prison cell and rotting away. But he simply was being treated as a second-class citizen up there in the way that we know that Michael Ralph has consulted Alfred, how that some people are up there for long periods of time and some people are just visitors. I was somewhat in the class of both visitors and then later an errand who was going up there frequently, but I was never staying there. I was always coming home. I never slept on Mars. Okay, so what did I see as we walked out of the cottage, Courtney and I? Well, the first thing you see is that there's very minimal vegetation on Mars, but in some places, in a lot of the earth, or a lot of the ground, you'll see tiny grasses and sedges and ferns and stuff, but it's very small and very fragile, kind of like when you plant a lawn. But in other places, you'll encounter a clump of plants or trees. It's almost like the environment that starts to spring up after a volcanic eruption, where you start finding small grasses and sedges and worts and stuff popping up through the pyroclastic soil that is left after the eruption, like on Mount St. Helens, for example, in Washington. We walked somewhat of a distance, and we encountered this life form. I don't know whether it was animal or vegetable, that looked sort of like lotus flowers with human faces in them. And there were about 20 or 30 of them in this clump, and they were kind of waving, and the human heads inside of the flowers were sort of talking but not making any noise. Kind of like those films where they have fish in a fish tank and they've been given human faces. And they were just sort of floating there and saying something, but I couldn't hear anything. But they were sort of floating there like an anemone colony under the sea. We walked down, and then we walked past these sort of plesiosaur-like creatures that were up on a ridge, but they looked much more like walruses. And I asked Courtney, what are those? And he said something like land walruses. And then when we turned around after about a mile or so, or a half mile from the skull that we had used to get access to the surface, when we went past them, they started barking, again like they were talking like humans, but also sort of barking like seals or sea lions. So they were up on the ridge kind of going, and he said to me, I don't know if this was true or not, maybe he was just trying to acclimate it to the surface. He said, they're saying goodbye to you. So maybe they were. We don't know what the spiritual development of these creatures were, but it certainly sounded like a chorus in which they were intending to communicate to me as a colony of like creatures. Then as we got within, I would say, about 40 paces of the skull, I saw over on my right what I thought, at 60 paces, I thought, well, that's a boulder, because we're always kind of like scanning the environment every 30 seconds. But then I saw a neck and a head pop up. And I said, Courtney, over on the right. And he said, yeah, I see it. And I said, is it a predator? And he said, I'm afraid so. And he said, listen, when we get within like 10 steps of the skull, just run like hell and jump through the eyes like you're jumping into home base in a baseball, or home plate in a baseball game. So when we got about 10 feet away, it could have been 20 feet, I'm not exactly sure about the distance, he said, 1, 2, 3, run. And we both started running at top speed, and we dove through the aperture there, the eyes of the skull, as it were, the eye sockets. And when we did, I heard this plesiosaur-like creature smack itself against the skull and go and kind of scream out in pain, like kind of like a dog when it's been injured. And then we scampered down the steps, and as we're running down the steps to the jump room, because we really wanted to get in the jump room, not just in the underground location there, I said, is that a carnivore? And this is a direct quote. He said, hell yes, that thing has teeth running all the way back down its throat. So that was my first attempt to evade a predator on Mars. And it was successful because, as Ed Dames had explained, the predators on Mars, almost all of them can be outrun by humans. That would make sense in a biome with limited nutrient cycling, right? Because as we found in our Mars data, Mars seems to have a greater number of creatures that are sessile rather than mobile, that just sort of loaf around every once in a while, which is adaptive in an environment of high predation because you're not seen by a predator, and low nutrient cycling. You don't have that much energy from your diet. So I think a lot, and certainly Ed Dames shared with us the fact that a lot of the predators will eat you, but fortunately we can outrun them, or at least are established to a factual certainty, has been secretly given at UCLA since during World War II. I found some truth adherents who had long-time tenured positions, non-professors, but they had staff positions at UCLA who said, yeah, we've taken all kinds of accounts of people sitting in this Naval Postgraduate School lecture program at night while earning their public degree. So in 1984, I earned my BA in history, but when I had my degree check in the College of Letter and Science advisor's office in Murphy Hall there at UCLA, she said, Andy, I've got a bit of a problem. I've got this set of transcripts for you. We've checked your social security number, your student ID number, and you're ready to earn a BA in history from the day division. And she said, when do you sleep? And I said, why? And she said, because I also have this set of transcripts, how you were like studying from like 7 to 2 o'clock in the morning, and you earned 36 semester hours, or quarter units rather, 36 quarter units of advanced math. Are you some kind of prodigy? And as we had been instructed in that class, I said, no, it's just a technical glitch, you can shred it. So I actually shred the evidence of that math degree. And again, I bring that up to show that even in our public universities like UCLA, young people are being decanted into secret educational programs. I mean, is that consistent with the ideals of a free people, of a self-governing people? I mean, I was placed in that by the CIA, and it was really being used as a context, I think, to control me during this 1981-83 time period. Because those were not only the years or the times that bracket that second secret baccalaureate program at UCLA, they are also literally the times that I was regularly going into Santa Monica, California, visiting an affiliate of the RAND Corporation, getting a little data diskette, the size of the ones that would emerge commercially 10 years later, the little 3 1/4-inch hard floppies with the 1.44 megabytes of storage. Then getting back into my car, driving to El Segundo, and parking where Courtney had first parked there on the street that used to be there, and walking into this building, checking in on the 5th floor, and then taking that jump room to the surface with the data disk. I was an errand. I think I went up and back about 20 times or so. During those trips, after the first 2 initial ones in the summer of 81, from fall of 81 to the end of the spring 83 school year, the 3rd quarter there at UCLA, I was taking those data disks up there, The jump room wasn't in the cavern. It was like this mine shaft where there were like 7 or 8 stories underground. And we would walk up a catwalk and onto the surface. I would walk about a quarter, well, not a quarter, maybe about half a mile to 3/4 of a mile. And just to give you an idea of how rudimentary our presence was before the colony was built, per se, there was just like this devastated brick building. It looked like the ruins of, let's say, a German city after, the bombing during World War II. There was just this decrepit brick building, and I would go through this opening in the front of the building, and there was one of our team members in kind of this computer console type room they had cobbled together on the ground floor of this gutted brick building. And I would just pass the data disk over to him across the table, and he'd say, "Thanks a lot, catch you later." And I'd walk back to the jump room and jump room home. Brett remembers one time on the surface, of course, that I scolded him for not looking around. But one thing that Brett Stillings and I were able to corroborate, and this shows you how there's a proof in the law that the counterintuitive factual assertion is often right. And it's kind of a counterintuitive or counterlogical kind of argument. Brett and I have corroborated the fact that we remember that when we were in the jump room on Mars, we were trained to push a master key and then the number of the floor we were on. Well, what would happen on Earth if you did that? The elevator door would open and we wouldn't have gotten home. But we corroborated the fact that both of us remembered our training and doing it, where we would push the master key, and then if we were on floor 2 of this 7 or 8 story mine shaft-like elevator infrastructure, with a human being standing behind a glass pane looking in at us, kind of protecting us, so to speak, we would push the number of the floor we were on, and that would cause the door of the jump room to close, unlike an elevator on Earth. We would hear on the intercom, "Are you ready to return?" And we were then supposed to say in a pretty loud, clear voice, "Ready to return." And then we would return via jump room to El Segundo. I think Brett is going to be a key whistleblower because he was being driven over there to jump room to Mars by his father when he was in the last year of junior high school, and is now going to come forward publicly. Okay, so that was basically my experience on Mars. The 2 trips, one by myself, one with Courtney Hunt, and then maybe 20 or 25 trips where I was just bringing data up there from Santa Monica to El Segundo to Mars and then back to El Segundo. Brett and I have been conversing and sharing memories of specific times when we were with Courtney Hunt on the surface. One time I told him, "Oh, Courtney's kind of gruff, but he's a good guy. You don't have to worry about him." I remember one time we were kind of like in this shack and there was wind howling outside. I know we were with Courtney Hunt of the CIA. Courtney was then about 50. He was born around 1930, so he was about 51 in 1981. Early 50s by 83. And Brett has remembered that when he was in the presence of Courtney and I was the one who asked him why he wasn't looking around all the time to look for predators. So that was essentially my experience on Mars. Sometimes when I was walking down to that gutted brick building to give the data disk to one of our personnel, I would see one of the more sort of, I don't want to use stigmatizing terminology here. Some of the Martians are hail fellows well met, like an astronaut on Earth, and some have a kind of more recondite personality and sensibilities, like where you'll see them walk past a doorway and they're like hyper wary. Of course, you'd have to be on a planetary surface with predators ready to eat you, but they just looked a little stranger. As Paul Goodwin has said, Mars is the Halloween planet. So these Martians were a little spookier, a little scarier in their personality, but I was always concerned about possibly being a victim of foul play on the surface because their personalities were so recondite, so frightened and secretive that it was strange to see them pass a doorway in their black caftans and look out and sort of, get a fix on who was walking by. This human, 20-year-old from Los Angeles. So I did have contact with Martians in that sense on the surface, but we were not liaising at that point to Martian humans or Martian semi-humans or the other typology of Martians, which is kind of a hybrid of a human being from Earth and a gray extraterrestrial, because we were there implementing the goals of the program, which was pretty much just to acclimate the Martians to the presence of Earthlings, but also to carry out some of these support functions. And in my case, it was to do what I had done in Pegasus as a boy, which was take information to a location where I could be counted on to remember where I was, who I interacted with, and able to get home in an alien place. So that was essentially my experience on Mars. There was really nothing more elaborate than that. I don't know if I have any long-standing effects from the jump rooms, but certainly if we standardize teleportation, I've been saying things like, imagine the day when you'll jump through a Tesla device at Grand Central Teleport in New York City and pop into view go through a vortal tunnel in time-space and pop into view at Union Teleport in Los Angeles. Well, since we've had the jump room technology here from 1980 or before, late 70s, we can do mass transportation probably just by jump rooms, so that even the elderly and the disabled could sit on the floor, be located on the floor of the jump room and make that journey via jump room from New York to Los Angeles or between any major world city or lesser place. So, in fact, we probably don't have to put the mass public through the trauma of feeling vulnerable in the vortal tunnel. They'll have the advantage of being encapsulated in a room, and then the door will open and they'll be elsewhere at their destination. Okay, so part 3, findings. Please hold your questions because I got a little bit behind in time when I was answering a lot. I'm now about halfway through my presentation. My findings begin in 2008 when I become fascinated by the public controversy over this image, the little lady in the blue dress, which is located on the far southern edge of the western periphery of the home plate plateau. As we look toward a westward view of the West Valley of the Columbia Basin of the Gusev crater of Mars. I had taken some art history at Cambridge, just auditing it just for general interest in art and stuff. And I saw clearly that this is a statue. We have the head, apparently, of a female, an arm, a flowing body that has been depicted to possess a human form. And unlike all the naysayers who really astounded me with the idiocy, just with the simplicity and oversimplification of their argument, there's a male figure here lying prone as if this was a statue, and he broke off and fell down. So this was from NASA image PIA 10214. So in fact, this controversy, which began after this picture was taken by the rover Spirit in November of 2007, this image was featured widely on the internet as a possible anomaly on Mars, beginning when it was released to the public by NASA JPL in January of 2008. So I was interested right away because I knew it was a statue. Okay, this form, particularly the female form, which is most evident, has been called everything, including Little Bigfoot on Mars. But I don't think our naming on Mars should be silly or referential. I think it should be as utilitarian and descriptive as the face on Mars at Cydonia. So I invented the terminology, the beings on the edge, because they're on the edge of the vast expanse of the home plate plateau. Now, why was I convinced beginning in January of 2008 that this was a statue? Well, first of all, it's made of stone because it's contiguous with the stone substrates of the home plate plateau, which is a large bedrock that, in fact, Richard C. Hogan has stated was actually the bedrock upon which a major structure or city was even located. So the little lady in the blue dress here is literally carved out of the edge of the stone, like there was a burl of stone that then got crafted into a semi-prone female and then attached male form. Artists have told me, Andy, there's something weird about this statue because she's either kneeling or sitting. She's not running. This is a semi-prone posture of sculpture, of statuary. The second reason, as an amateur art historian, a couple classes in it, that I was convinced it was an ancient statue, is that it possesses highly articulated human form. In nature, we have things that we look at a Camel Rock in New Mexico, and we say, well, that kind of looks like a camel. Or the Old Man in the Mountain in New Hampshire, you kind of see a man's face. but you don't get a classical human form carved by the forces of nature, wind and water and time and fragmentation and so forth. You get something that we then have to apply the pareidolia effect to see a human form or some animal form in. You don't get literally the articulation of an intentional statue, and that's what we see in both of these forms. I noted also, number 3, of course, the trait that convinces me it's a statue is duality. Nature has never, to my knowledge, accidentally carved two intact human forms that have a dualistic relationship. That exceeds the laws of probability. 4th, there's correspondence. I clipped this out and I found that I could migrate this up here, and the right side of the male was dovetailed right into the left edge of the female figure, like South America and Africa were before those continents separated. Of course, there's also gender, and there's gender actually represented by clothing, in the sense that the apparently female form with the more dominant breasts and a wider hip displacement, as we find in female humanoids who carry live babies in their womb, also corresponds to the fact that the male seems to be wearing more male-like garb in the nature of a shirt and pants, and he's also bald, where she seems to be possess either long hair or some kind of hood or scarf around her head. So I found gender assignment just in the differentiation between their apparent clothing.
The male, I don't see it at all.
You don't see him at all? He's broken off and his head is here. His arms, like he had his right arm around her, his arms are here. His torso is here, his tummy's there, and what we can see of his pants and leg are here. And there's kind of like an insert. When porcelain artists make a composite statue, they create a tab on one piece, and they use like a tongue and groove method, and they put a little aperture in the receiving piece, and they then put the two pieces together and they fire it, so you get two forms that are attached. He's literally the male figure that was on her left with his arm behind her or around her, and he's now broken off and tumbled down to the side, so that the male piece of the statue is lying prone with his head here, his right arm here, his left arm here, his midsection, and then what we can see of his legs. And I actually cut this out, and this edge, when rotated and enlarged, fits perfectly into the left side of the female form. Do you see the female form? Yeah. Okay, so I found gender and clothing. I mean, nature had never put pants on the old man in the mountain in New Hampshire, nor a saddle on Camel Rock in New Mexico. I saw movement, as I said, from a layperson's perspective. I thought she was running, but artists have told me she's sitting down or beginning to kneel, or gingerly walking down with the right leg cocked this way, as somebody does when they kneel or genuflect or gingerly walk down an incline, but not running. Then artistic styling, in the sense that, okay, this isn't just a dress. This is a dress with some kind of texture to the way that it's formed. That is to say, there's some elegance to the folds of the dress. It's not accidental. It's not a tube skirt, but a more classically flowing gown of some kind. There's fragmentation, and that's one of the traits of ancient statuary. Over time, statues break because they're made of stone or terracotta or something else. In fact, the Venus de Milo once had arms. So here we have a female statue with the male figure broken off, and indeed her left arm may have broken off, but her right arm, with flesh tones evident at the end of it, and then some kind of blouse, the right arm of a blouse indicated there. So fragmentation actually establishes the intentionality of statuary. And then I think the coup de grace is, as many of the sculptors that I called, well, that's a pedestal. I said pediment in my paper, so I asked the forgiveness of the artistic community. I said pediment in my research paper. I meant pedestal. She's on a pedestal. So a sculpture implies the existence of a sculptor. This constituted, I realized in January 2008, not even thinking about my Mars experiences earlier in life. In fact, beginning 28 years earlier in life, and back in 1980, just focusing on the phenomenology of what we were now seeing on Mars, I realized this constituted prima facie evidence of life on Mars, because statues are made by statue makers, and the statue makers have to be advanced intelligent life forms. Not necessarily Homo sapiens, but at least life forms evolved enough to think about making representations of life forms on their planet or another planet, and possessing opposing digits, opposing thumb, or at least opposing hands to craft sculpture or statues. Now, what was even more disturbing, and that Alfred I have to commend again for being right in there as a leading exopolitical theoretician and practitioner, he was right in there with humanity, listening to me and helping me publicize my findings, because the rest of this statuary complex there at the edge of the home plate plateau is fraught with frightening implications, and that is these two forms, at least the female form that's still there, is mounted on the head of a rock carving, which is a plumed serpent that bears some residual pigmentation, but it's basically a horse-like or reptilian-like head or alligator-like head that is biting the neck of a bearded white male human, and that blood is ushering from the bite wound right here. So what we have is a Jesus-like figure here with hair and a beard and an eye and an eyebrow and a nose. And this hirsute reptile, this hairy snake, is lunging over and is shown representationally to be biting his neck. And then red pigment was used to show him being sacrificed. Now, Alfred noted that this would be consistent with the plumed serpent iconography of the Aztecan and Mayan cultures. Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent god, being the mythological creature present at human sacrifices. Well, humans sacrificed by whom? Other humans in the Aztec and Mayan experience? Reptilian ETs on Mars who may once have been on Earth? We don't know. All we have here, what I did know is we had a very macabre statue featuring potentially these two Homo sapiens supplicants at the top of the statue, beneath which we could see a sort of a human avatar literally being bitten to death on the neck. Now that could be a work of art in and of itself with no ultimate consequence. That could be some kind of funereal statue in a Martian cemetery that showed the ultimate experience of death that all living creatures undergo. Or it could literally be a ritual sacrifice area of humans, or something else. But as I began to contemplate the fact that this first statue we were finding on Mars involved the death of a human being, I became quite alarmed, and Alfred and I were actually trying to get the paper out in December of 2008 because we realized we had found disturbing data on Mars. You know, you find the first evidence of life in this sense, in an indirect sense, on Mars, and you find this kind of statue, it's cause for concern. Then branching out beyond the expanse of the home plate plateau, I thought, well, if there's a statue, there's statue makers. And that led me to find in this rock enclosure on Tsiolkovsky Ridge what I contend is a flesh-toned humanoid with a bulbous head here, the V-shaped torso and the pants and legs. And then in this picture you can see a little better, it's a wider shot. So you can see sort of the gray ET face on this beveled rock here, and you can see sort of the solar face on this more scallop-shelled kind of rock. This is an intentional enclosure, like we would put slabs of boulders together like at a rest area on a state highway. And then beyond there's this circular enclosure with other bulbous forms that seem to be the heads of juveniles of this species. This would be consistent with what Virginia Olds, a career CIA officer, told me 4 days after I published The Discovery of Life on Mars, that there are several humanoids, including one that more closely resembles the gray extraterrestrials of the UFO contact literature. What do we have? We have the bald head, the neck, his torso. On some images, I can even see the scalpuli on his upper back, pants cinched around the waist, which demonstrates the intelligence of clothing or cultural advancement involving being garbed, and his belt and his legs. He may be standing or even just kneeling in the dirt back there, but this was, a close-up of this is, of course, the image that my father showed me when he was cutting my hair back in 1969, back in Morris Plains. I concluded that, at a minimum, we now had a bipedal life form that may be from the species that had carved the macabre statue up on the cliff top. This is actually in a hill that's down in the valley that NASA claims is 100 feet across from left to the right, or right to left, right where it joins the valley bottom. If that's the case, the width of the shoulders of this creature is about 1/200th the width of that 100 feet, and hence 6 inches, and so he would be about 20 inches tall. But again, NASA's been fudging its data so much that I don't know whether Tsiolkovsky Ridge on Mars is 100 feet across or 1,000 feet across. I know they've been taking pictures of very large areas, just like if we parked a car and a camera in Mulholland Pass in Los Angeles and filmed the San Fernando Valley. This is the guy walking across the street in Van Nuys. Okay, that I believe, ma'am.
Okay, so is it possible? Well, my first part of this question is: this image that was taken. Is there another image of this same section that was taken simultaneously on a different angle?
Yes, and not this one, but the sculpture. You're actually asking the scientific question, which is, if NASA is going to uphold its mission that it was given under the NASA enabling legislation of 1958 to promote the advancement of human understanding of space and the near-Earth environment, it needs to return to all these locations where independent researchers like myself have found probable life forms and rephotograph the same location.
So, in relation to that, so this frame and the previous one, where I can kind of, when you pointed out the face on the left rock, I mean, to me that's incredibly vivid, and I almost see like a feminine.
Yeah.
A feminine energy, right?
Definitely the bisymmetry of a humanoid face.
So, okay, so let's see if I can wrap my head around trying to express this. So this picture and the previous one that you can see those other 2 images, I'm wondering if possibly that's not actually physically there, but if if you take a picture and you see an orb in that picture,
right.
Perhaps that's an alternate dimension or another reality that's been captured.
Right. Well, let me address that.
Okay.
The images that NASA's publishing on the internet are evidence that NASA states in its official policy are its dispositive findings from the surface of Mars. So if something's in it, using Occam's razor, we have to say, well, this is NASA's photograph. If it's not, if it's been intentionally placed there by NASA, NASA is being caught in a scandal where it's making life forms and artifacts look like they're on the surface. And that obviously would create a huge political scandal, because it is stating that it is the space agency of the United States and it is photographing what's there. Now, at the level of optics, you identify other possible interpretations that are germane to photography in general, including photography on Earth. It could be what's there in our time-space location. It could be a paraphysical form that's there in our time-space location. Or the optical photography they're using could be cutting through to some other dimension on Mars or some other period of Martian history, in the same way that you could take a photograph of your mother and see a Civil War soldier standing next to him, right? So that's the nature of digital photography. So our premise here is that we think these are there now, but they're just photographs with evidence of life on Mars. He may have been there with his family in the back here 100,000 years ago, and because of the resonant signature of their presence in time-space, the digital camera may have cut through and captured him. The problem, though, with a non-ordinary explanation like that versus the first explanation we would reach, applying Occam's razor, which is the ordinary explanation, is once the separate photographs begin to accumulate. I mean, most photographs are ordinary in nature. They capture what was exposed right in front of the lens in real time. Some kind of non-ordinary effect of a ghost or a time slip doesn't usually occur. So as we begin to accumulate hundreds and now thousands of images of life forms and ancient artifacts on Mars, that becomes a brief for ordinary causation rather than non-ordinary causation, just numerically speaking. For example, every digital photograph that's taken on Earth, most of them are the people in the photograph, not the ghosts, right? It's the ghost photograph is the rare, non-ordinary one. So now, after 3.5 years after doing this research, I'm convinced that this guy was really there on the hill on the day that the rover Spirit perambulated out to the edge of the home plate plateau and shooting across to Tsiolkovsky Ridge found his rock enclosure there on Tsiolkovsky Ridge. Another thing in the photograph that would support physical rather than paraphysical and real time rather than non-ordinary or time slip is the synergy between an advanced intelligent life form and intentionality to the rocks. You know, ghosts don't usually do any heavy lifting. Okay, you follow me? So there's a causal connection here between terraforming his local environment and his presence in that rock enclosure. That's technology, right? That's an artifact. Okay, but that's a good question because we're dealing in some cases with transparent beings that I think result when NASA is using a visual recognition system to import background data into a really apparent form, like a humanoid form. We start getting these transparent things that I call the glass beings in the paper, into the discovery of life on Mars, until I grokked the fact that they apparently had this standardized visual recognition system where they were turning opaque life forms like this into apparent glass beings because they were importing background data, and all that was left was the discrepant outline between the edge of the being and the background, their immediate background. But here that didn't occur. Why wouldn't that have occurred? Because his humanoid form is broken up by the rock. So probably what the visual recognition system saw before it tried to edit this out of the picture was his head and shoulders, and then the edge of the rock, and then the bottom of his legs, and then this side of the rock. Most of our findings of human and animal life forms on Mars involve this kind of local superimposition that would be a technical glitch that would occur that would defeat the visual recognition system that we believe is being used to identify forms of humans and animals and blot them out of existence by importing random data into the periphery of the form. Another form of corroboration of these two discoveries is that to the right of this rock enclosure with the humanoid being there on Tsiolkovsky Ridge, named for the Russian rocket pioneer who first suggested the use of space platforms for reaching the Mars and Moon. I hope it's not Mr. Tsiolkovsky calling me from his grave. But so here, over on the far right side of PIA 10214, we call a very peculiar anomaly that I call the grotesque humanoid skull, which is this cone head-like skull here. It's hard to see in this shot. With the eye sockets, it may be one of those egress points from the underground civilization. We've got a hand here. There's a little creature right there sitting in the hand. And I thought, wait a minute. I blew this up and I wait a minute. Why is this guy sitting here, right here? Like we would be sitting on the grass playing a guitar. And why is this female sitting here? Why does she have multiple appendages? And she's leaning forward like a woman might on the grass, where she has her legs under her in a demure way here and is leaning forward, like let's say a musician would, sitting on the grass, playing a saxophone or strumming a lyre or something like that, maybe singing into a microphone. So I then began to blow up these details, and I found that there was this bizarre thing that I've named the grotesque humanoid skull. And again, it's one of these artificial skulls with the eye sockets. Here's the nose, kind of a George Washington kind of nose, a little elephantine perhaps, and deep, deep eye sockets. And then where his hand is coming, here's his thumb and index finger, middle finger here. He's actually holding a little Martian right here. Here's his head, his gray tunic, and he's sitting operating some kind of keyboard with apparently something up to his mouth, sitting in this little seat that was fashioned from this grotesque humanoid skull. It looked like some kind of Martian campground, sort of, where I actually could see that, and you can see this in this image. The area where they've been recreating or walking around is actually darker soil here. See this area here? Like on a beach on Earth, where people have established a campfire or campground, and it's darker because it's trammeled more and maybe some moisture has come up from underneath. But this soil is all darker right around the periphery of this apparent male what I think is clearly a female, multiple appendages, and the male there, and there's some over here. There's actually a pregnant female right here behind a patch that got superimposed over the image. We can see her head, her arms that she's holding behind herself to steady herself on the ground, and then her belly is distended, and one of my anomalous friends noted that she's looking right across at a group of like objects that are on the ground that might be larvae or babies in swaddling clothes here. Now, why would they have put this extra data over the pregnant female? Well, what does a pregnant female form show? Something that you really don't see elsewhere in nature. You know, the distinctive distended belly of a pregnant mammal or humanoid is identically a life image, you know, a life design. So I think they superimposed data to block her out, because it could be a sunscreen or something, but it doesn't seem to, the shadow pattern doesn't indicate any kind of shadow effects. Well, there's shadowing here, right? So if the sunscreen had been in play, she would have placed it in front of herself here, not to her left. I think this is the visual recognition system that NASA's been used in this case to obscure a pregnant female humanoid in an immediate location near another female with multiple appendages, an apparent male who seems to be larger than both females, and a very kind of tubby, larger creature right here with irregular features, a head and a torso. He seems to be throwing something. When I think, you know, when I look at the fact that this one seems to be holding a keyboard, and this one has his arms like we have when we're playing a guitar, and she's holding something right up to her mouth like you'd hold an alto saxophone, I wouldn't be surprised if these are Martians recreating and actually playing musical instruments, not at the beach, but at the park where the grotesque humanoid skull is. So we can't, one of the ways of seeing the life forms on Mars is to not see or imagine Mars as we would wish it to be, but just try to see it as it is, because it is, after all, another planet with a distinctive ecology and civilization. We have to be respectful of that fact and not superimpose our judgments over this image, for example. Maybe this grotesque humanoid skull wasn't built because these types of Martians have a sick artistic sensibility, but just because this is some kind of amusement park where there are fanciful sculptures like this. I mean, we don't know. So we want to withhold our judgment until we find out more and more about the U.S. presence on Mars and what we've learned about the indigenous ecology and civilization. So I can see it very clearly on my laptop, so if anybody has any questions later, I'd be happy to stay and show you better images that are here. There's a little bit of over-illumination, of course, whenever you do PowerPoint publicly like this. But here's a blow-up of the skull. Here's a blow-up of the male figure sitting on the grass. Now somebody said, Andy, those must be sculptures because you've got this blending like you get, you know, when you make a porcelain Madonna. You know, it looks like a painted piece of porcelain. But that could be obliteration from the multiple iterations of the photograph. That doesn't necessarily have to be as flat and curvilinear a form as it is, as with the female here with multiple appendages. She's got literally 3 appendages coming out of her right side, like a crustacean would, or a hellgrammite or something like that on Earth.